volumes have surfaces that are flat or curved. And when they're frontally disposed, they might have a harder edge to them. But as soon as those surfaces are either inclining away from you or curving away from you, how are you going to show that dimension of it moving back in space without softening the edge? So if you want to convincingly paint a bowl, the rim of the bowl, which is in the front of the bowl, might have a harder edge, right? But what about those curving sides that are curving down and curving away from you? Are you going to give those a hard edge? No, you're not, because otherwise it's going to look flat and sort of cut out and sit on the front of the picture plane. So if we're, let's just say we're painting a sphere, and some of you like to paint eggs, or there's fruit that are in the still life maybe today, right? So if you paint a hard edge going all the way around that spherical object, what's going to happen is it's going to start to look like a flat disc instead of the dimension of something going back in space or curving away from you, right? So in general, I would say anything with a curved surface, anything spherical, the curve of the head, curve of a bowl, a piece of fruit, an egg, all need really soft edges in order to create that illusion of it curving away from you. So another aspect of edges that's hierarchical is the atmospheric aspect. And by atmospheric, I'm talking about light. So you might be painting something under a very harsh focus light, which requires a harder edge. But then, of course, even outside of that pool of light, things, as the light diffuses along the edges and moves into shadow, what's going to happen? The edges have to get softer. Sometimes we're painting things under a really soft diffuse light. Like, you know, the skylight in here is putting a beautiful soft diffuse light over everything, right? But if you paint it with too hard an edge, it's going to look like the air has been sucked out of the room, right? But if you want that feeling of space and air and light, everything needs to be painted with just a hint of softness. I mean, at least a hint of softness. A very bright light, even though it may be harsh, if it produces glare on your subject, like a very reflective surface, or a very bright light because it is the light source, you might have to really soften the edge to produce that feeling of glare. So, you know, in my rose fire paintings, that would be an example. You've probably seen those around the studio where there's a lot of glare, and so I really have to soften the edge of that bright light. And lastly, having to do with light, we mustn't forget about cast shadows. A cast shadow painted with a hard edge looks like an object, right? Like a patch of something laid onto something else. But if you give it a soft edge, then it can look like a film of darkness, which is what a shadow is, overlaid on top of an object. So even if you're looking at a shadow and you see a really hard edge on it, I caution you about painting it that way. Because you have to remember that when you're painting in a visual language. You're translating what you're experiencing in 3 dimensions through this filter of not only your senses, but this thing we call the visual language of painting. And the business of studying painting is getting to know that language really well and to be a master of it, right? And that's one of those things in the translation that you have to really just be adamant about, is not painting a really hard edge on a cast shadow, because it'll look like a thing instead of a film.